Good evening and welcome. I'm Michael Lindsay, Assistant Professor of Sociology and a Rice Scholar here at the Baker Institute. I want to welcome you to our very special evening dialogue between Francis Collins and Neal Lane, talking about the human genome and the relationship between science and public policy. We've put at your seat there some question cards, and we want to give you an opportunity to be part of the conversation. If you have a question that you'd like to direct to either Dr. Collins or to Dr. Lane, we're going to invite you to jot that down. There will be ushers that will come through the aisle a couple of times in the first portion of our segment. So get your questions ready, and then we're going to be fielding those. I'll be approaching the two with a couple of the questions that you might have to offer to us. So please, if you don't mind, make sure to get those written down in due course. We have two distinguished, eminent scientists who are joining us this evening. Neal Lane serves as the Malcolm Gillis University Professor here at Rice. He's also the Senior Fellow for Science and Technology at the Baker Institute. Previously, Dr. Lane served as the Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy under President Bill Clinton. Prior to that, he was also the Director of the National Science Foundation. We here at Rice like to claim Dr. Lane. He spent most of his professional career here. Before he went to Washington, this most recent time, he served as Professor of Physics and also the Provost of Rice. But Dr. Lane began his career here at Rice as an Assistant Professor of Physics after completing his PhD at the University of Oklahoma, where he also graduated undergraduate Phi Beta Kappa. Dr. Lane has won all the major teaching awards that make him a credentialed Rice professor. He's also won numerous scientific prizes, been recognized for his scientific achievements in many different ways. Rice has had to share Dr. Lane a couple of times as he's gone to Washington. He served as director of the physics program at the National Science Foundation, and then for a couple of years was the chancellor of the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. But we were able to lure him back, and he's been here ever since. We're very grateful to have Dr. Lane. Joining him this evening, we have Dr. Francis Collins, who's most recently served as the director of the National Human Genome Research Institute at the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Collins is a world-class genomicist. His landmark studies have been in a variety of different fields. He actually, it's interesting enough, was originally trained as a chemist, earned his PhD at Yale. While he was taking graduate courses at Yale, he came across the subject of biochemistry, which really intrigued him. That in turn led him to apply to medical school, where he earned an MD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And then later he joined the faculty at the University of Michigan. While he was at the University of Michigan, he and his colleagues identified the gene that was responsible for cystic fibrosis, one of his most significant early scientific discoveries. But that in turn led to a number of other innovations, including isolating the gene for Huntington's disease and the M4 type of adult acute leukemia, among others. In 2007, Dr. Collins received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, our nation's highest civilian honor. We are indeed grateful to have both Dr. Lane and Dr. Collins to join us for this evening. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Collins and Dr. Lane.
You want me on the other side?
Oh, yeah, that'd be great. Well, it's wonderful to have both of you here. Thank you so very much. We want to get started by just hearing a little bit of your own stories. And I wonder if, Neal, if we might start with you, if that's okay. Can I call you Neal? Is that all right?
Please, yeah.
Yeah. Francis, that's all right?
Yes, please.
Yes. So would you mind telling us of when did you first get involved in science and public policy? What was your first foray into public science?
It's kind of a continuum. I mean, when I decided to go into physics, I had no interest at all in policy and had no expectation I was going to spend any time in Washington for, except to go to the museums and do all the other things that are wonderful. So I think it's really a continuum. All of us in our field get involved with federal agencies because they got the money and they want advisors, so you end up serving on advisory committees and you submit proposals, you review proposals, all of that stuff. One thing leads to another, and probably when I began to complain about the funding for my field is when I got involved in public policy. So I'm sorry about that. It's not that money's the only thing that we have on our minds, but that's what got me started. So I complained enough that they said, well, if you're so smart, why don't you come and spend a year running the physics division at NSF? And so I said, why not? After checking with my wife, of course. And that got me introduced to government, and I saw it was a funny transition at that point. I'd be interested in Francis's response. That first experience actually working for a federal agency had a large effect on my feeling. You suddenly become, it sounds maybe kind of corny, but you suddenly feel like you're doing something for the nation somehow. I mean, the transition from working with your graduate students, doing something for your research group and your university, to, gee, I'm doing something for the whole country. That just feels good. And that never left me, and I think that probably gave me the sense that if the opportunity would arise in the future, I would like to do more. But how that ended up in Washington for 7 years, I really don't know. But I think one thing leads to another, which is a message I always give to students who ask, treat everybody nicely because you just don't know. You're going to be working for them someday, so be careful and don't put any possibilities out of your mind. Always be open for an opportunity when you get the chance.
Francis, how about you?
It was a similar, I think, sort of twisted and unpredictable pathway. First, let me say what a privilege it is to be here and to be on a panel with Neal Lane, who I greatly admire and had the privilege of being in the same room a couple of times with him when he was in Washington at critical moments. Who knows, we might come to talk about those things. I guess my first real sense that a scientist has to think about the policy implications of their work rather specifically came around the time that my lab, when I was at the University of Michigan in 1989, was able to find the cystic fibrosis gene, which had been a long and difficult search. And we had to make a decision about what kind of intellectual property claims ought to be attached to that discovery. And I hadn't thought much about that. It seemed sort of odd that you could claim a gene that everybody has as intellectual property anyway. We could also talk about that, I suppose. So one of the decisions that got made at that point was to do this in a fashion that it was non-exclusively available to any laboratory that was interested in doing diagnostics or therapeutics, which was fairly unusual at that time, although it's now the recommended policy by NIH. So I got a little deeper into that. And shortly after that, I got my first invitation to come to Washington and be a witness at a hearing. And the hearing was about whether we should do the Human Genome Project, because there was a big debate about whether it was time to have a national, international effort focused on trying to do this in a targeted way, as opposed to just hoping it would happen. And the main person who was asking me questions that day was Al Gore, because he was a senator at the time, and he was really interested in this stuff. He'd finished inventing the internet, and he was ready to do the genome, and that was energizing. I mean, you could really get the sense here something might happen as a result of the words that people spoke that afternoon. And it did shortly after that. Finally, the Genome Project got some initial funding. Never did it occur to me that day that it would be my job 4 years later to come to NIH and be responsible for managing that. And then that really plunged me into the policy issues in a huge way, in terms of how do you make decisions about priorities of science funding? How do you decide what are the major issues that need attention sooner rather than later? And a big focus became genetic discrimination. And how do you make it safe for people to find out information about their own DNA? Ultimately, we figured that's only going to happen with federal legislation. It took 12 years to get that part done. But this past May, President Bush signed the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, and that was just one of those moments that you hope will happen and had so many forward and backward steps that it was almost difficult to imagine we actually got there, but we did. And that's, I think, a wonderful example of science and science policy having to work together to get something done.
Francis, let's talk about the beginning of the Human Genome Project. Mm-hmm. So it was a lot of money that was being requested, right?
Yeah.
And I'd like you to tell us, how was the decision made and who did the persuading? Was there sort of some internal debates of whether the government should actually be behind funding something so expensive?
Of course, these days it's hardly any money at all. It was just $3 billion. I mean, come on. So, yeah, there was a big debate. And in the late 1980s, when this was being talked about in the scientific community, the majority of scientists were opposed. They thought this was a bad idea. They thought it would be technically unfeasible, that all of these statements about reading out 3 billion base pairs of DNA was just a pipe dream. They thought it would potentially end up costing a lot more money than anybody said it would. And so the budget would balloon out of control, and it would take money away from investigator-initiated research, which we all recognize as the mainstay of success in science in the U.S., in biology especially, where there hadn't been any big science. Not like physics with accelerators. Biology didn't do that stuff. And a lot of biologists didn't want us to do that stuff. And then there was this fairly obnoxious comment that you wouldn't want to do a genome project because the only scientists that would want to work on something as boring as that would be the mediocre ones. And so you would just be stimulating mediocrity. Some of us really took offense at that. Fortunately, the robots did the boring stuff, and the rest of the science was pretty darned interesting. So there was all of this debate going on. There were meetings held at Cold Spring Harbor was a particularly famous one, where there was a big debate between Wally Gilbert and David Botstein. Wally saying yes, David saying no, which is interesting because he later became one of the major proponents. I think a particularly important step, and this is a good lesson when you have the time to do it, was the National Academy of Sciences impaneling a group to look at the question, should we do the Human Genome Project? And choosing somebody, Bruce Alberts, a cell biologist, who was fairly skeptical as the chair, and filling up that panel with a lot of the skeptics, including Botstein. And when they deliberated for 18 months and came forward and said, yeah, we should do this, but here's how we should do it. And they laid out a very careful plan, a stepwise process of starting with model organisms, working on the technology, not even starting to sequence human DNA for several years. And that was the blueprint that got the project off the ground, and it was pretty much the blueprint that got followed. And that had a lot of credibility, and that really got the whole thing to the point where a lot of the scientific community said, well, okay, if you have to, we're going to watch this really closely. Then, of course, the Congress had to pay for it. And getting something started from zero was not going to be a trivial matter. And it really was, in that case, mostly the Congress, and the administration played a smaller role. And in fact, that's often the case with the appropriations. The president proposes and the Congress disposes. And when it comes to research funding, the Congress generally kind of gets the last word. And this is where Jim Watson stepped in and played an absolutely critical role. And having Jim chosen as the champion for this was a brilliant move, because he was the rock star of biology. And Jim knew that, and he played his role well. This is not an apocryphal story. He would go to some senator's office, and at the door he would untie his shoes and walk in with his shoelaces flapping in order to encourage this view that he was just an absent-minded professor and shouldn't worry too much that he was about to sort of dive into your wallet. And dive he did, and he was very good at that, because they all thought, if Jim Watson says this is something we should do, and of course Jim would also say, and if you don't do it, your grandchildren will hate you, or the Japanese will get there first, which was even scarier. They said, okay, where do we sign? And that got the project started, and for the first couple of years, a little bit of a ramp got going, and then it had credibility, and it was hard to say at that point, no, we don't want to go any further. It was starting to work.
And what about, there was along the way, there was some conversation about whether this project should be done through the private sector, right? There was a NIH scientist, Craig Venter, who was interested in saying he could do it faster and more cheaply. How did that play out?
And he was not the first to propose that model. Goodness, way back in 1987, Wally Gilbert, who had been on that National Academy panel, resigned because he said, I'm just going to start a company and do it. He couldn't raise the money to do it, because at that point nobody really believed it was possible, at least in a measurable period of time. Then there was a guy, Rick Bork, who was a entrepreneur who also made a ploy in the early 1990s that he was going to step in and take this on. That didn't get very far either. But then Venter appeared in a very credible way in 1998. Somebody who knew what he was doing as far as sequencing, the first guy to sequence a complete bacterial genome, Haemophilus influenzae, a couple of years before that, and linking himself up with the company that made the sequencing machines. So that was a pretty powerful matchup. And they basically said, we can do this faster, better, and cheaper, raised about $400 million, and started to push this forward. And this was an interesting time, because it was an opportunity, I think, for the public to begin to understand that there was a genome project. I would say before 1998, by my survey, which was talking to people sitting next to me on airplanes, the understanding of this project was maybe 10%. And after this so-called race for the genome got going, then because people read about it in papers or, God help us, in People magazine, you knew that something was going on. And people knew that I rode a motorcycle, and they knew that Craig had a yacht, and it suddenly became news. And it was kind of silly, because the real point was, are we going to do this, and what's going to happen at the end? So the real difference between the two projects was not so much the technology. We were both using the same sequencing machines. It was not so much the goal, which was to get the complete human genome. It was, where is it going to reside? Is it going to be in a public database with immediate access every 24 hours, which has been the public projects model since '96? Or is this going to be a commodity that you will have to pay a subscription to look at, with a lot of patents being filed along the way? And you can understand why that latter model had to be the case for a company that's trying to pay back its stockholders, but it was a very different model. And it was odd that that somehow didn't quite seem to sink in, that that's really what the stakes were here. So we got into an interesting juncture there, and sort of weekly reports of who was ahead of whom, most of which you could quickly verify with the public project, because we were giving our data away every 24 hours. There was no secret about how far we were. And you couldn't tell anything about what was happening in the private project because they were private and that was not their model. So.
And Neal, when you were in the White House, if I remember correctly, there came a time when this conversation about intellectual property arose, and the White House issued a statement that said that the raw data for the sequencing of the human genome should not be able to be patented, and It had some unintended consequences. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I think the statement had been under consideration for a year or so, and I had discussed it with Prime Minister's science advisor Bob May at the time, and then with Lord Sainsbury later, who was essentially the Minister of Science. It's not quite that title, but he had the ministerial level. And the idea in issuing this statement was to make clear what was really already policy, long-standing agreement between the U.S. and U.K., our principal partner, and all of the other nations in the international project, that the raw sequence information coming from the genome should be in the public domain. That's not patentable. That really should belong to the world. And so nothing had really changed. It's just that there was suspicion that some of the private companies, in particular Celera Genomics, Craig Venter's company, was thinking about treating part of that genome as intellectual property in ways that would be inconsistent with people's feelings. Genes were patentable, and people had patents on genes. Question of whether they'll all stand up or not, I guess maybe still is out there. Maybe Francis can help us on that. But people were sequencing genes, which is a little piece of the genome. Our statement had to do with the whole genome, just the raw information, the sequence. So the statement got put out, but in the press event, it got muddled a little bit by the media people. And it gave the impression that the Clinton administration would no longer allow anybody to patent a gene. Well, that was a big deal to the biotech companies, and a lot of investors that didn't know the difference between a gene and a hole in the ground. And they thought all of their investments were going to be worthless. And so they pulled their money out of the biotech market, and the market lost, everybody has a different estimate, but I think it lost between $30 and $50 billion in a few minutes, if not a few hours. And Francis learned about this reaction as he was walking over to the White House for an event that we were all going to do together. I learned about it as I was walking in the press room to explain the statement when a reporter said, "Dr. Lane, did you know that the biotech market has just crashed?" And I honestly said, I didn't know that. But I said, I'm sure it had nothing to do with the President and Prime Minister's statement. And as far as I knew, it didn't, but of course it did. So next morning when I went into the staff meeting, I think it was Gene Sperling, was the President's advisor on economic policy, said, I would like to start this meeting by congratulating Neal Lane, who did, with one statement, what the Federal Reserve has been trying to do for 6 months. But I didn't feel somehow good about it all, and so It was a very special occasion. It was a misunderstanding, but the statement was correct. Even if you read it today, there was nothing wrong with the statement. It made clear what really had always been an understanding, but the market just went crazy. The NASDAQ also crashed at the same time. One drove the other, and I remember a few hours later I was on the stage with the head of NASDAQ at that point, and I got to whisper in his ear that I'm sorry we crashed his market. And President Clinton announced at an event he was at, I said, we crashed the market, we didn't mean to. And I had a lot of calls from people that had lost billions of dollars. And what do you say if somebody calls and says, I lost $5 billion? You say, I'm really sorry to hear that. I don't know what France's response to the whole statement event was, but that was my view about what happened.
Very much what happened. And again, it was this misunderstanding, and because he was named in the press at the time. It was Joe Lockhart, who was the press secretary at the time, who did a morning briefing every morning for the press that happened to want to know what was going to happen that day. And the event was the awarding of the National Medals of Science. And the president thought, well, it'd be good to have something else to say to go along with this award ceremony, so let's roll out this statement that has been in the works for a year, and that'll make it more newsworthy and everybody will feel good. Well, not everybody felt good, because Joe, I guess, thought, it must say that they're just not going to allow any more gene patents.
Yeah, it was at least that's what the reporters picked up.
Yeah.
And about a week later, when the dust had settled and we were in staff meeting, I said to Joe Lockhart, I got a really good idea for a new statement between the Prime Minister and President Clinton. Didn't happen. That was the last statement having to do with science that we put out in the White House, I think, at that time.
Yeah, let it be known.
What that shows, though, is in those places, a little mistake can have a huge impact. That's why people feel the weight of these jobs on their shoulders all the time. You can imagine if you're the president, but I'm just a staffer, and so is Joe Lockhart as press secretary. So you make a little mistake, it can have an enormous impact, because people are just waiting for that kind of stuff to happen. So you have to take your job seriously. You have to be very careful.
So let's move out of the past and talk about the future. So, Dr. Collins, there's been some rumors that you might have a job coming down. Do you have an announcement for us?
Not today.
Not today, okay. Well, one of the things that we're sort of curious about is what you think will be coming down the pike in the Obama administration as it relates to science funding and access to scientists. Do you think things will be different in the next 4 years than they have been in the past?
So I left my job at NIH in August after 15 years directing the Genome Institute, in part because it seemed like 15 years was a long time and I was getting restless, and in part because I wanted to be outside of the sort of government service role to see if I could be useful in this clear turning of history in some new direction. And so I've had the privilege of serving on the Obama transition team since the election, and it has been intense and inspiring, and at times really quite difficult to sort through a mountain of opportunities at the time where the economy is clearly so severely in trouble. But one of the things that Harold Varmus, who's the head of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and he's also been working on the transition team on biomedical research issues and the science agenda in that arena. We both looked as hard as we could at the data to try to see what is the evidence that you could make the case that investing in science is actually a good solution for a struggling economy. And the case is extremely strong, stronger than I had realized. In fact, if you look at the evidence, it is pretty clear that more than half of the economic growth of this country since World War II has been on the basis of science and technology and innovation. More than half. So if we are in trouble now, we should sort of look and say, are we taking full advantage of science as a potential to stimulate our economy? And it's clear we're not. By every measure of how we have been competing with the rest of the world, we've been losing ground relative to other countries, particularly more recently China and India. And it's also clear that we have been losing, especially in the last 5 years, where funding has been flat for science in the face of inflation eating away at it, that we have been losing scientists who have been giving up because they can't get funded, and that there is a great sort of pent-up need that could be quickly stimulated with some support. There's also a wonderful study done, I think, quite rigorously in an economic sense by Families USA, asking the question, if you put $1 into NIH funding, what comes back as far as your return on investment? And in their conclusion, it's about $2.50 for every dollar within 1 year in terms of economic goods and services. And you're also creating jobs. If we had just been able to fund the grants that were sent to NIH last year that made it into the top third, but couldn't get funded because we didn't have enough money, that would have created another 50,000 jobs, right like that. So there's a very strong case to be made, and that case did get made, and the economic stimulus package, which is of course very much under debate still, but what you may have seen coming out of the House version, which was heavily influenced by discussions with the Obama administration, does include some substantial funding for NIH, about $3.5 billion, and about $3 billion for NSF, heavily focused on energy research. So I think in this instance, you're already seeing concrete evidence that science is being seen as a potential solution to problems. And of course, the solution goes beyond the economy. It also goes to the need for energy alternatives, for climate change. It goes to the solution for many of our health problems like cancer and diabetes and heart disease, where we could be going faster if we had the support. And I think that resonates in the new administration. I think if you listen closely to the inauguration speech yesterday, and I was standing there on the Mall with very cold feet about a mile away from where the action was, but I was enjoying the words, and science appeared in that speech in a way that reinforced what had been stated by Obama during the campaign, that science was going to be an important part of this administration's agenda, and that he was not concerned that science might sometime give answers that he didn't want to hear. He wanted to hear them anyway. So I find that to be an encouraging start at a difficult time, and I'm hopeful that we will see science at the table when these conversations are going on in a way that can really help our country and our world. We need a lot of help right now.
I want to turn to some of the hot button issues, if we might. Neal, I want to ask you about stem cells. So last year, researchers were able to reprogram some adult cells in mice and treat them so that they would act like embryonic stem cells. If researchers are able to do that with human cells, do you think that that will decrease the importance of embryonic stem cell research or not?
Well, Francis knows much more about this than I, but we have been very involved in stem cell research and stem cell research policy at the Baker Institute for a number of years. We've had several conferences, and we're planning another one to be held in Qatar in the spring. So that's our involvement in stem cell research. And one thing I think that breakthrough did do is stimulate the press to suggest that maybe it isn't so important to change the rules, change the regulations on research on embryonic stem cell. As you know, President Bush's policy on this was really pretty restrictive, that any stem cell lines established before August 9, whatever it was, 2001, could be used by NIH-supported researchers, but no federal money could be used to generate new stem cell lines, and in fact, researchers couldn't use any stem cell lines that were created after that time. So it was sort of a moment in the clock, which struck some people as strange if it's an ethical argument, but nonetheless, very clear what the rules were. It's also quite clear that President Obama is going to change that policy, and he can do so with executive order, and may have issued that executive order, which I may have missed today, but in any case, he can do that if he chooses to do that very soon. But the question is, well, do we still need that? Because it looks like you can reprogram somatic cells, so here's some somatic cells, and now I can make a bunch of stem cells. It ain't so easy. And I think the stem cell researchers still make very clear, including the ones that made this major reprogramming breakthrough, that fundamental research on embryonic stem cells is still the key to understanding development at that stage. And had they not been able to do research on embryonic stem cells, in fact, they wouldn't have been able to do the reprogramming work, as I understand it. So it does create something that makes it harder for people to understand if you can reprogram and not have to mess with embryos, then why shouldn't you do that? But I think the counter argument is it is much more complicated than that, and it is not an argument for not continuing work on embryonic stem cells research. Did I get it roughly right, Francis?
You've got it absolutely 100% right. I think that's very well said. My own lab works on these reprogrammed cells, the iPS cells as they're called, induced pluripotent stem cells. And it's very clear from talking to the experts in that field and going to their scientific meetings that everybody uses the human embryonic stem cells as the gold standard to try to decide whether an iPS cell approach is working or not. If you don't have the gold standard, you don't know whether you've achieved that. There are probably 600 or 700 embryonic stem cell lines, human lines, that have been derived using non-federal funds since 2001. And they are probably much higher in quality, many of them, than the ones that were available at that time. And the fact that you could not currently use those for federal research has certainly created a problem for the field and certainly caused us to lose some of our competitiveness with other countries.
Cloning is another subject, and there seems to be some real consensus around the issue of therapeutic cloning, but I want to ask you about reproductive cloning. So let me give you a scenario and tell me what you would do. So you've got a husband and wife, and they're both infertile. Something's wrong with the sperm, something's wrong with the egg, and they want to have a child on their own, don't want to adopt. If the technology is able to do reproductive cloning safely, should we do that? Should we allow that?
I would say no. I would say no strongly and definitively from my own perspective, and I think it resoundingly represents the view of the scientific and the bioethics community. First of all, you said if we could do this safely, it's not clear we'll ever know whether we could do it safely without trying it, and then if it isn't safe, what have you done? Every other reproductively cloned animal, including Dolly, has been abnormal in some way. So it'd be very likely that that would be true for humans as well. And if that's the case, then no matter where you stand on other aspects of this, this seems like it's off the table on straightforward safety issues. Let's assume that somehow that magically goes away. Then you have to ask, okay, who is going to be the source of the cell that is going to be used for this reproductive cloning? Are we making a clone of dad or of mom or of some other person? And what is the meaning of that going to be for that individual when they grow up and realize that they are different in their origins than everybody else around them? If they are a clone of mom or dad, what kind of cloud is that to live under when you're trying to size yourself up and your parent is too? That doesn't seem like you are bringing the child into the world for the same kinds of reasons, hoping for something different. It seems like you're hoping for something that's a absolute carbon copy. And then finally, I think the issues of bioethics, particularly for people of faith like myself, this is a different way of a human being coming into being than has been the case in the past. Is this really part of what we're supposed to be doing here? Or is that crossing a line into territory that is more God's territory? I think there's very legitimate issues to be raised there. So put that all together, and I would say, please, let's not do that.
Ethical deliberations are tough. Neal, I wonder if you could tell us about the most complicated ethical deliberation you had to engage in over the course of your scientific career.
Well, I think that one was not complicated. I mean, President Clinton, in his executive order, made clear that reproductive cloning was banned. And by far, I think the majority of scientists asked would say the same thing.
Except for a few that wear silver jumpsuits and claim they've been abducted by aliens. I think that's pretty much been the case.
One thing that the National Bioethics Advisory Committee, though, did say when they were asked by President Clinton their opinion on this, and that was at Dolly time, and I wasn't yet in the White House, so my hands are clean, whatever. I was supporting research at NSF and didn't know a clone sheep from a particle accelerator. But what the Bioethics Advisory Committee did say, or at least coming out of the discussion, was that the issue, though, ought to be looked at in the future. They didn't want to just say, now and forever, all the ethical issues are clear. That's my recollection of what you find in the record, and my colleague who knows about these things nods. I think that's correct. And so the point I would make about time is that how long before the medical technology will be such that you could assure the public with a fairly high level of confidence before implantation, by just things you did in the lab, just things you did in vitro, that in fact was very likely to be safe. I mean, you never know 100%, not like you never know with any kind of medical procedure. So suppose you could get through the safety barrier, then get past the safety issue, then the other issues you raise, of course, are very important. But there's so many ways young people are brought up in the world. There's so many ways they're conceived unintentionally or at least in an awkward situation, let's say. And then there are, of course, happy couples that adopt children and so I think that larger issue of how a child thinks about how he or she was conceived or showed up in this family or is a larger issue than just reproductive cloning. And I think it's worth more discussion, I guess I would say. The ethical issue that got me was the experiment that was done where a cow egg had been, a real cow, I mean a bovine kind of cow, had been denucleated, and the nucleus, I think, of human DNA had been placed in and allowed maybe to multiply a couple of times. No intention to ever do any implementation. And the bioethics committee was asked about that when I was in the White House, and their answer was that it's a special kind of biological entity, but it's not clear it's an embryo. I mean, nobody has been able to show, at least at that point, don't know about today, but maybe even today, nobody's been able to show that an animal egg with a human nucleus, some people will call it chimera, is it technically correct at that cellular level? Okay, so it's a chimera, that actually is an embryo, but it makes everybody queasy, and it made the White House staff very queasy. And I remember, I think it was Paul Begala said, "No cowman. We ain't going to have any cowman." And President Clinton issued an order, I think the next day, that we're not going to do that kind of research. And so it wasn't exactly a quandary at all. Once I heard there was no cowman, then it was pretty clear we were not going to do any more of that work. But it does raise a number of interesting ethical questions, because part of the problem with embryonic stem cells, if they're produced in vitro fertilization clinics and so forth, I mean, eggs are human eggs are very precious entities, and so if in fact you could technically show that you could start a stem cell line by using an egg from a cow or a pig or some other animal, and then a human nucleus, what about that? Raises a lot of interesting questions. Those questions did not all get answered when I was in the White House, but those were the kinds of things that came up. And fortunately, we had a wonderful National Bioethics Advisory Committee, chaired by Harold Shapiro. At that time was president of Princeton University, a place you know well, and you know Harold, terrific chair, and we always got very good answers, thoughtful answers to the questions. So I think that committee is still in place with President Bush. There are different people on the committee, but it's the same idea. It's a very, very important way that scientists, and in this case, ethicists and theologians and other non-scientists, can get input into the policy process, very important input. So it gives me a chance to say, we need those kind of bodies, and they need to have scientists, but they need to have other people involved in the process.
What about you, Francis? What's the most complicated sort of ethical deliberation?
I think they fall in the areas of enhancement. People, I think, generally embrace with open arms the possibility of curing terrible diseases or preventing them. But when it comes to taking a normal individual and trying to enhance their function by biotechnology means, people start to get a little uneasy. And it's difficult to draw a bright line there between what's ethically okay and what isn't, because we're enhancing our kids all the time. In fact, when your children are vaccinated against some terrible scourge of a virus, you're committing a biological enhancement that's not only considered acceptable, it's considered not to be responsible as a parent if you don't do it. And that actually involves some rearrangement of DNA in some of your immune cells. So we couldn't actually say, well, no DNA enhancements will be allowed. We're already doing that. But where are we in terms of trying to draw that line in other circumstances? If, for instance, we are able to come up with a way to prevent morbid obesity by a gene manipulation or even a drug that turns out to really work well, and that then becomes attractive to people who just want to be a little slimmer, or maybe even really slim in order to perform some role in our society that seems to so value this, namely modeling. Is that something we want to support? Is that actually a good use of our biotechnology skills? Grow hair. And again, we're already past that point. We haven't brought up Viagra yet, and I won't go there, but clearly that is an example where enhancement has found itself into commercials on the Super Bowl. So what should we do, though, when this comes to the prenatal arena? Now, this is where I think the real difficult boundaries are being wrestled with more effectively in other countries than ours, because in vitro fertilization in the U.S. is completely unregulated, and that's where decisions about prenatal diagnosis, particularly pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, are being made. There are lots of in vitro fertilization clinics that will do a pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. That is where you take the embryos that have been created by sperm meeting egg and you pull off a cell off of each embryo and you do a DNA test to see what is the nature of the DNA in there. And there are plenty of clinics that will do that for sex selection. Now, sex is not a disease. Or is this something we're glad about? Some of them say, well, we'll only do it for a family that's already had 3 kids of one gender and they really want to have another, but not all have those limits. Should we be, that has been developed particularly for couples that have a very high risk of a serious recessive disease, like Tay-Sachs disease, for instance. But increasingly, people are asking, well, could we do that for an adult onset condition? In the UK, that's been approved by their authority, and they have an authority that looks at this, for BRCA1 mutations that cause breast and ovarian cancer in women, but not until generally 30s, 40s, or older. So we're starting down that line, and I think people are wondering, if you saw the movie Gattaca, which is very much a portrayal of how PGD is being used on a broader scale, are we headed in that direction? That is sort of an enhancement. It's an enhancement of taking your possible embryos and picking the ones that may seem to be the most appealing from whatever point of view you happen to be taking. And that just has all kinds of queasy attached feelings to it, not the least of which is the implication that we are beginning to devalue diversity and devalue people who are differentially abled, and that we're somehow seeing that children all have to be absolutely perfect in the view of their parents, otherwise you take them back and ask for another one. And that's a troubling image of how we as humans might be headed. So that's where I'm sort of, I guess, most uneasy without having any good solution, because there is no bright line that I can see where you can say, don't cross this. It's very blurry.
And what about the role of individual scientists? So how does an individual scientist sort of sense of ethics and morality enter into these public conversations? At what point in time do you rely upon the bioethics boards, where you have theologians, philosophers, and other folks, but who are not necessarily scientists? And at what point do we really need the scientists to have the training or the understanding to be able to make some of these moral adjudications?
I think the scientists do not have the corner on the market on ethical thinking. In fact, scientists, by definition, have a conflict of interest. They like to do science. And that's good. We want them to. But I think that means that when it comes to a difficult ethical decision about whether science ought to go in this direction or that direction, there have to be other people at the table. The scientists have to play the role, and this is a responsibility, I think, for all scientists, of engaging with that process very vigorously and explaining the facts of the matter, because otherwise the ethical conversation may go way over here into an area of application that's completely unfeasible and miss the one over here that actually might happen next month. And you have to keep that conversation going. And I think, again, Harold Shapiro, the way he ran the National Bioethics Advisory Council, was the model. There were scientists who brought the facts to the table, who had their opinions, usually very well informed, but I think they would also admit inadequate to fully tackle some of these difficult issues. And there were bioethicists and members of the public who had a chance to weigh in. It was a deliberative process. It didn't have to come to consensus because you sometimes can't, but it at least could get in the direction of where the general sense is that boundaries ought to be drawn. Scientists, yep, got to be part of it, shouldn't be the ones making all the calls.
But I agree with that, but I think you would be the first to say, because you are one, that there are many scientists who are not willing to go beyond certain points. I mean, they have their own set of values and morality, and so all scientists are not just going to push it as hard as they possibly can.
Oh no, and I didn't mean to imply that. They may be a little bit more inclined in an area where they're personally really excited about the potential for the
Nobel Prize is right. That's right.
And I don't think that's a big effect, but it might be in there. But I agree with most scientists actually have a pretty reasonable moral compass, and they use it appropriately. And I think that is a critical part of the conversation, but it can't be the whole thing.
Yeah, and I think the point you make is more important than what I said. Because we don't have very many occasions like the Bioethics Advisory Committee where scientists and social scientists and non-scientists are sitting down together grappling with these issues, and every day we're going to be facing a new one. Yeah. And the pace at which medical research is advancing, and many other fields as well, and the coming together of the physical sciences, nanotechnology, and biology coming together is going to present society with challenges that we probably can't even imagine today, and those challenges might come within a couple of years. Right. And I think we don't, my sense is in society we don't have a mechanism to have these kinds of discussions that we really need.
One final set of question for both of you, which is what do you think will be the, let's say, 2 to 3 big issues that relate to science and public policy over the next 10 years that we're going to have to grapple with or engage, either ethical deliberations or new possibilities that emerge because of scientific discoveries?
So I think the whole field of personalized medicine is going to be exploding in the next 5 or 10 years. The opportunity for each of us to find out individual susceptibilities to illness based upon what we're learning about the genome, to use that same kind of information if you need to have a prescription for some illness to know whether that's the right drug for you at the right dose, or whether there ought to be some alternative, so-called pharmacogenomics. And it's also going to fuel a whole new and more rational basis for drug development that will give us drugs for cancer and heart disease and diabetes that are more likely to be efficacious and less likely to be toxic. And so this is going to be a huge opportunity, and one which, if it is played out to the fullest, should actually reduce our healthcare costs because of the ability to focus more on prevention and less on waiting for people to get sick and end up in the ICU. But it may not be in the short term possible to see that payoff is happening, and that's going to lead to all sorts of questions about who has access to this and who decides what can be done for whom at what point. So that's going to be a huge scientific opportunity in the healthcare arena. Obviously, across other parts of science, I think all of us would point to energy, to the need to come up with renewable energy alternatives, clean energy alternatives, and at the same time that we're trying to get rid of our addiction to foreign oil, do something about this increasingly scary climate change data that seems to be, every time you see another report, looking like it's going even faster and more alarmingly than you thought before. And it's hard to think of a scientific challenge that is more pressing now than that one. But it's going to take a lot of national will and worldwide will to address it, obviously. And I guess finally I'd say global health. We can't really sit here in this wonderful country with all of its abundance and ignore the fact that most of the people in the world are afflicted with terrible diseases that we could be doing more for if we made it a priority. Malaria, AIDS, tuberculosis, a whole long list of parasitic diseases about which we are learning a lot, much of it coming from the tools of molecular biology and genomics, but we have not invested in using that information for prevention and cure the way that we could or that we should. And I think that is going to be, again, hearkening to what Obama said yesterday, something that we need to pay a lot more of attention to. And we could achieve great things with this sort of soft power approach to the rest of the world, and the way in which that would build stronger alliances and more friendly relationships with other countries that we need as our friends.
I think, well, I can't do better than that list. Obviously, there'll be surprises. There'll be things come along that are hard to see that could have, the asteroid is coming. That's suddenly going to be a big deal. Well, I think we don't expect that to happen over the next several years. These are the issues that Francis has outlined, are the issues that John Holden, the new science advisor, and Harold Barmas, Eric Kandel, the new chairs of the President's Council of Advisors on Science Technology, and are going to be dealing, and the heads of the agencies, whoever they are, and in the future are going to be dealing with. There's one other issue that I think society is going to figure out how to deal with, and it really does bring science directly together with the most deeply held feelings about people, and that's the following, that as science continues to progress, we understand more and more and more about life. What is a living entity? There are people right now, Craig Venter's company, I think, artificially making life, or trying to. It'll be relatively primitive at first. I don't think it'll be anybody we can talk to. It'll be a tiny little piece of a microbe. But it does raise the question about, as we understand biology and living things in general at a minute scale in time and entity, a molecule at a time, it raises more and more questions about what is the nature of life, what's the nature of God, what we're going to hear about in a little bit. We're looking forward to that very much. But I think it's going to require a conversation between those people who are understanding life at the biological level and people who have concerns about that, or have deeper questions to ask, or where they feel that really challenges their deeply held religious beliefs. Religion is a powerful force in our society and the world, obviously. It's going to remain extremely important to humans for a very long time. And we cannot afford to have a fight, a battle between science and religion. We can't have that happen. And I think increased understanding is necessary, and a dialogue is a way to get at that. But I'm very worried about the issue. I think it'd be bad for science, be bad for religion, not to somehow come to grips with this. You and I haven't had a chance to talk about it. I'll be very interested in your thoughts. But I think we're not doing as well as we need to do on that particular topic.
Well, thank you very much. We ran out of time. We had so many good questions and not enough time to answer them all. But I do appreciate Dr. Lane giving a good promo. We're fortunate to have Dr. Collins is going to be giving another address at 7:30 this evening, to which you are all invited. There's time for you to grab a bite to eat over at the Student Center or at Brockstein. It'll be right across the courtyard area in Shell Auditorium at the Jones School. It'll be on the context of Dr. Collins' book, The Language of God, talking about the relationship between personal faith and scientific exploration and his own journey along the way. It should be a terrific event, and we hope that you can join us. We're going to let them actually excuse themselves because he's got to make it to the next speaking event, but I hope you'll join me in thanking Dr. Collins and Dr. Lane.
Thank you. Thanks. Well done, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
We also hope you'll join us for future events at the Baker Institute. There are a number of things that we do here related to science and technology and a whole range of issues related to public policy. Thanks for coming tonight. We'll see you next time.